everyone, it's Alex, and as an unofficial A24 character, I felt it was my duty to read Memorial by Brian Washington because it was recently announced it's going to be made into a A24 limited series. Not to mention that Memorial's been getting a lot of buzz since releasing in October of last year, and I think it just released in the UK. Memorial is about two men named Mike and Ben who are both in a relationship, which is a very general term. The beginning backdrop of the story is set in Houston, Texas, where Mike and Ben live together in a diverse neighborhood with evolving gentrification. And while the novel isn't about gentrification, there are these subtle nods to race being a primary perspective from both Ben and Mike, which leads me to state that Ben himself is a middle to upperish middle class African American man, and Mike is an Asian American man from Japan. The novel opens with Mike's mother coming from Japan to visit Houston to see Mike, but just as she arrives, Mike is actually leaving for Japan to take care of his dying father, therefore leaving Ben to kind of babysit Mike's mother in a way. Be that as it may, with the hijinks-filled premise, I did think initially that Memorial was going to be this pining love story about how distance is immeasurable. Instead, I was given a lethargic romance with these bitterly depressing undertones about how both Ben and Mike choose to navigate their lives. Overall being that I think the effectiveness of Memorial is this simultaneous indulgence and resistance to the imaginary gay canon of the ideal gay relationship, primarily of being two men often imagined as white. Since to me the story was really about it being crucial for both Mike and Ben to understand whether or not they see their identity first through their race or through their sexuality, while contributing to a refreshing spin on the coming out narrative. Meanwhile, I will say that I found Washington's prose really able to paint a scene really well, as well as knowing how to strip a scene of its intimacy without coming off as stifling or withholding. But somehow Washington really struggles with some scenes being touched with a bit too much of feeling cinematic, which strangely feels misplaced at times, and could have rather fit in nicely with these moments of fleeting flirtation to help distribute tension, even if the point isn't romance. Rather than feeling largely static, to me, also unfortunately being that sometimes it was hard to tell Mike and Ben apart from each other with how similarly they are written. I totally understand that men seem all the same, but it's a bit too committal of I don't think there's enough staying power to really quite differentiate the transformation of both Mike and Ben's personalities, even if they are worlds apart. Otherwise, what I did like is primarily when the book talked about Mike and Ben interacting with each other through this social posturing, as their most intimate moments together really felt like caricatures of their identity in a good way, kind of coming off as this insecure defensiveness, indicative of both Mike and Ben's accrual of emotion of not just being perceived as gay men, but gay men of color, which to me feels intimate in its own way, of how they both see each other as not being spared from their own crisis of identity, as they both share to each other their confessions of their haunting microaggressions that are both subliminal and literal. This actually happens as early as page 6 whenever we're introduced to how Mike and Ben get to know each other. Starting off with Ben's perspective, Ben says, "It took all of 2 dates for him to bring up race." "What if I told you you're too polite?" said Mike. "Fine," I said. "Or that you're so well spoken." "I get it. Sorry." "Don't be sorry," said Mike, and then he boxed my shoulder. It was the first time we touched that night. The bartender glanced our way, blinking. "I just hope you see me as a fully realized human being," said Mike, beyond the obvious sex appeal. The cadence of conversation and dialogue this way is so organic throughout Washington's prose within Memorial, which kind of ends up bubbling up to us understanding that Mike and Ben have never formally actually come out to their families before, other than Ben, who has, but it's treated much more, as we realize, like an afterthought. Speaking of the family members that are other characters in this book, they really do feel more like side characters, I would say, but they're just barely dynamic enough to feel impressionable. So with conversations with family or interactions with them, it really does loom over the topic of sexuality without Washington writing it like it's a rite of passage or has immediate reconciliation. Really leaving it up to Mike and Ben to have this journey of self-actualization that I think Washington is really good at sort of making it feel really revelatory or inspired for them to really take the reins on understanding themselves, having Washington create characters that certainly do feel they have this approach towards tenderness to really sort of interrupting the template of what the world may consider being for people sort of coming to terms with things like their race or their sexuality, which Washington shows to us that is not completely fulfilled or proven or even discarded once someone's symbolically come out, but it's really a process you have to do repeatedly. For Ben specifically, it's his own personal narrative of also us finding out that he's HIV positive and how his family kind of uses that to create the narrative of what it means to be gay. For Mike, it's this burdened narrative of a culture clash which climaxes whenever he confronts his father. So with all of this in mind, I want to get back to how I initially thought that Memorial was going to be a love story. Washington pitch perfectly crafts dialogue with male-to-male sexuality with this anxiety and aloofness within its own little world of being these constant internal assessments of having to come out repeatedly even to random hookups, which never seems to quite live up to this imaginary sensuality of the other person's idea of what it means to be a gay man or involved in gay sexuality. For example, one character does go to have a hookup with this guy in his childhood bedroom, which feels symbolic of inexperience and insecurity. And in this instance, Washington excels at this exhaustive conversation in as little words as possible to show the bare minimum of courtship between men in this way that I realized does not spare or exclude Mike and Ben from each other and how they also act with their interactions. Which becomes so striking because I feel like for most of the time in the novel, Mike and Ben are kind of in this fog, but they really do feel most emotive whenever they are in conversation with their families in particular. Kind of dispelling the idea that the acquiring of one's identity through their sexuality perhaps isn't just involved with the strict romantic side of it that perhaps gay narratives sort of propel, but it's also really about the platonic and familial love that you have to take care of and really grow and develop with people around you for your whole life. Which, saying it out loud is kind of like, no duh, but with contemporary gay fiction, I feel like Memorial is kind of the light bulb that I've been looking for. Being this search for personhood that isn't just about the romantic, but isn't inspired by direct conflict either. Having Washington string me along into this fake love story that, to me, the overall punch being that with that hookup scene I mentioned earlier, that kind of being the purpose or realization that Mike and Ben are just two people that happen to be helping each other at the right time. As Mike and Ben possibly felt lured in to this fog of their relationship, feeling like they had to live up to the pedestal of what it means to be in a gay relationship, which instead grows into being this relationship that feels like kind of a sweet takedown of this fantasized gay illusion of not having it entirely be about the romantic, while Washington still punctuates that one's coming out narrative is not any more costly than someone else's, but instead can really foster this sense of community. In Mike and Ben's case, being two people enduring the coming out narrative experience at the same time, literally sharing the same space with each other within the book with these shifts of narration. So while I enjoyed Mike and Ben's isolated journeys to realizing more about themselves, I will say the Pitfall Memorial also feels like this feeling of isolation. Because as readers, we do find out the primary sort of vignettes of Mike and Ben's relationship being through flashbacks, it was really hard to really feel the scope of exactly how Mike and Ben felt about each other in real time. And I don't think the flashbacks necessarily helped bridge the gap enough to really crafting that self-awareness that I felt I ultimately led myself to. But thinking, for example, of even Mike and Ben's interactions with their families in real time did feel a bit stale in comparison to the context because of the flashbacks. So I'm not sure about long form with novel-length works by Washington, but I'm definitely going to be checking out Lot, which was a short story collection that came out I think a couple of years ago, but is also very buzzy by Washington. So I'm definitely going to pick that one up soon. If you've read Memorial or you plan to, definitely let me know your thoughts about this book, because I do think it's kind of finally this breath of fresh air I've been looking for with these gay books I've been reading. So 2021 is off to a good start. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.